Hi again. This time I am up here to talk about my favorite frame for examining differences in communication styles, which is something called ask versus guess culture. It's a culture class that can cause a lot of tension, especially at work when you're not aware of it, so that's something that I'll make sure to cover in this talk as well. So let's start with an example. Okay. Here's the situation. This is you, and this is your friend, Jamie. Jamie has a friend that you've never met named Taylor. And Taylor is going to visit your city and needs a place to stay. But you'd rather not host a stranger. Your friend asks you, can Taylor stay with you? What's your instinctual reaction in your head? Not out loud, just in your head. Is it, oh, I'll just tell them no? Or, this kind of puts me in a difficult position. That was just a quick litmus test. If you think it's not a big deal to just say no, you are most likely from ask culture. If instead this situation would make you feel really uncomfortable, you're most likely from guess culture. As far as I can tell, this ask versus guess culture description first came up on an Ask Metafilter post in 2007. The way it's described there is, in some families, you grow up with the expectation that it's okay to ask for anything because you're totally okay with getting no for an answer. This is ask culture. In guess culture, on the other hand, you avoid asking unless you're pretty sure that the answer will be yes. And the way that you know if the answer will be yes is by putting out delicate feelers, which, if done well, means you won't even have to ask, you'll just get an offer. And even then, you'll have to use your judgment for whether to accept this offer because maybe it was just to be polite. Because if you accept the offer, are you imposing on this person too much? Fundamentally, in guess culture, you feel that putting other people in the position of having to say no seems rude. This is a spectrum, not a dichotomy. Based on my own experience, different regions in the US are at different points along this scale. Places that have a really strong reputation for being really nice tend to be guess culture. Globally, some countries have a culture of being really direct, like Germans, while others are much more indirect, like in Japan. So let's go through a couple more examples. This first one is from a Medium piece I read about something the author called the Seattle No. I don't think it's necessarily specific to Seattle, but that's where the author had grown up. So it goes something like this. Hey, I'm going to this party. Do you want to come along? If the answer is anything along the lines of, that sounds interesting, I'll have to check, or, oh yeah, maybe, and you don't hear from them again about this means no. Which maybe that was really obvious to you, but if you're not from guess culture, there was never a no actually in there anywhere, right? It's not obvious. All right, here's another one. Normally on the weekend, my husband Dan and I each cook one big meal to have leftovers for the upcoming week. One weekend, I offhandedly said out loud that I don't have time to make lunch for next week. I was just talking out loud about how I wouldn't have time to make lunch, but he interpreted that as, could you make some extra meals for me? And so as a result, he said to me, I'm going to cook 2 meals this weekend. And in my head, I'm thinking, that's so weird. He's planning to make 2 meals, but okay, whatever. And I did not say, oh, you don't have to do that. And so as an end result, at the end of the weekend, I'm sitting there thinking, why do we have so much food in the fridge? And Dan's over there thinking, I'm such a good husband. So I want to talk a little bit about the pros and cons of ask and guess cultures. I have a preference for one, and I'm sure my bias comes out, but that doesn't mean that it's objectively better overall. In ask culture, it prioritizes efficiency in knowing exactly where you stand because there's no ambiguity, which often helps get what you want, at least in the short term. But it does end up being a lot more confrontational sometimes, which can make people feel uncomfortable, maybe even alienate them. Guess culture, on the other hand, prioritizes avoiding hurt feelings or embarrassment from direct confrontations. It's often considered more polite, but it does depend on a tight net of shared expectations. You have to be able to recognize the subtle signals that other people are sending and receiving. And so if you're like me and you're kind of bad at reading social cues, that can be hard. But if you're from guest culture yourself, but you're in an environment where people don't share your expectations, you can end up feeling like no one is listening to you at all, ever. So let's talk about some strategies for how to handle ask-to-guest situations and vice versa. Generally speaking, it's about trying to step a bit more into the other culture so that your message is clear and people are comfortable. And now that you can at least recognize the difference, you're most of the way there. If you're from ask culture, my first tip is to make a guest culture friend who can be a guide and interpreter. This is what my husband is for me, actually, because oftentimes if I'm confused by some interaction, I'll bring it home and you'll help me dissect it to see what was being said between the lines. Because you have to remember, it's not just what people say, but what they don't say as well. Because you might not have heard a no, but it wasn't an enthusiastic yes either. And so you have to pay attention when there's any kind of hesitation. Of course, you'll mess up sometimes, and so just to try to apologize and clarify later if you realize too late that what you said might be misinterpreted, that you sent out a guest culture signal that wasn't in fact what you intended. If you're from guest culture, well, when I was practicing this presentation and asking my husband for advice, he actually told me that guest culture people don't need to hear this. They already understand it all. But I couldn't handle the asymmetry from leaving the slide bank, so just a couple quick points. If you're angry or frustrated with someone because it seems like they're just in your face all the time, remember that they might be unaware of the rules, and it might take some education to bring them on board. Basically, have some pity for people like me. Also, just try to resist the urge to soften a no. I know the intention is to not hurt people, but sometimes an excuse can end up backfiring a little bit. So I want to quickly touch on a few work situations where the ask versus guest culture clash might come up. On a peer-to-peer level, there's obviously situations like code review or working across different offices. And as always, it's all about the relationships. I recommend being a bit more deferent until a relationship has been established, because when you have a friendly relationship, they're more likely to interpret what you say in a favorable light. Try to check in at times outside of the hustle and bustle. If you're a guest culture type of person, you can even enlist an ask culture type of person to help advocate for your point of view in more confrontational settings. One phrasing that's helpful to remember is before you ask people for something, say up front that it's okay to say no. Even for guest culture people, you can use this to remind yourself that other people can say no to you too if you're feeling uncomfortable about something you have to ask. So in the manager to report situation, I recommend discussing communication styles and trying to use your preferred mode to get feedback on whether you're understanding something correctly. For me, I'll keep asking questions and then try to judge how strong the responses are. One thing you can do is to offer up several options to choose from versus having only one option that they have to decline. And when you are offering something, be extra enthusiastic to demonstrate your sincerity. Lastly, if you are an ask culture person managing a guest culture person, this is a situation to be really careful in because you have to constantly remind them that they can say no when you ask them to take something on. Because if they do work up the courage to say no, you have to give this positive reinforcement. And if you reverse this decision without enough explanation, they will never say no to you again, even if you want them to. Finally, this is a topic that I am a little obsessed with, and I love to talk to people about it. So if you ever have any questions for me, please just ask. Thank you.